Welcome to episode 222 of School Librarians United. I'm your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian wrapping up my 16th year, I knew I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, my interview guests, and listeners who reach out to the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. Friends, I love hearing and sharing listeners' good news, so congratulations to Rebecca in Washington State. She's currently a full-time math teacher and attending library school, and she just found out she will be a middle school librarian starting next school year. I'd like to thank Leah and Becca, two amazing public librarians in our neighborhood who have delivered satellite collections to our school this year to circulate while I am building up our collection. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to listeners Sabrina in Idaho, Laura in Michigan, Kim and Christy in New Hampshire. Sam in South Carolina wrote, I first started listening to your podcast as an MLIS student at the University of South Carolina. Listening to your episodes were some of my favorite assignments since they were so practical and directly related to my future career. Recently, I've accepted a position as a middle school librarian for next year and will be transitioning out of the elementary classroom, which I am so excited about. However, it is also nerve-wracking, and I have been working my way through your backlist of episodes. Every single episode I've listened to has provided me with practical advice, inspiration, and confidence that I can do this job successfully. I've loved listening to your experiences in the high school as well as your experiences of your guests. Just this morning, I listened to Lunch in the Library, which has given me ideas on how I want to handle this time of day in my library. Unfortunately, I am taking over a media center whose librarian left in the middle of this year, and they never filled the position. If you have an episode that addresses how to enter a library that hasn't been maintained and or without a librarian, please let me know the episode number so I can get advice. If not, I think it would be a great idea for a future episode. Thank you so much for all the time you spend on your podcast. I truly appreciate it. So friends, this is Amy, and I did want to mention a couple things. First of all, as for using podcast episodes for graduates assignments, I think that is fantastic. Friends, yes is always the answer. I have talked to a handful of instructors, and I've said out loud a couple times on this show that if anybody, whether you're using this for PD in your school during the summer or perhaps for a meeting that you're going to have or an alternate activity to do to sort of spark a conversation or start perhaps a district initiative or a building initiative, it's not unusual for people to do a deep dive with a podcast episode to give them some ideas. And I've oftentimes said, listen, anybody can use the episodes. These are out there for everyone, and they will continue. I have a commitment to make sure that this content remains free and accessible to school librarians wherever you are in your journey. And I did a little hunting because this idea of picking up and taking over a library space which had been either dormant for a while or neglected, there were a couple episodes that came to mind, and I'm sure I'm missing something because anytime you create a list, you're bound to offend somebody. So I beg your pardon. But I didn't have a playlist for this. So I'm thinking, first of all, episode 71, Boosting Circulation, stands out very, very strongly in my memory because I interviewed a friend of mine who is one of the reasons why this podcast ever took off. She was sort of my sounding board, and her name is Chelsea, and she was one of my assistants years ago. And we were talking about things, and all of a sudden our conversations morphed into episodes which became a great deal of season 1. Anyway, so Chelsea was in episode 71, Boosting Circulation, and she did this thing where she came into a situation where the room had not only been sort of, dormant, it had been locked. And so went in there and sort of revved up this space that once sort of breathed life into it. And for several years was working on building this this library because there hadn't been anybody in there. And it was a wonderful sort of transformation. Also, episode 115, Inheriting a Mess. And that one is, for me, a particular favorite. Episode 135, Navigating a New Library. And episode 154, because episode 154 is library volunteers. And in every single one of these cases, these were librarian volunteers who were going into schools where the doors had been locked, where the spaces had not been used. And so had it not been for these volunteers who had gone in, the spaces would have remained locked for the immediate future. So anyway, fantastic question. And that doesn't mean we won't record something in the future, but I did want to also share with you something that I included in my email to Sam about taking over a space that was not occupied for quite some time. First of all, it doesn't matter who left that space. You are an instant hero. If you go into a space that had been dormant or neglected, you become this wonderful person who is going to be responsible for any victories moving forward. And so I think that this is always an opportunity that should be embraced, because all you can do is improve upon the situation, because the situation before you got there was bleak. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity for you to shine as a professional and to remind your school what really happens when you put a librarian in charge of a library. It's obvious to us, but, to the rest of the world, maybe not so much. Friends, I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions. You can reach me either on Facebook, on Twitter. My handle is @LMS_United, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And I have to say, this past week, I sent out quite a few stickers. And so if you're interested in getting a sticker, just all you have to do is contact me and share with me either a school mailing address or send me your home address. And I promise, I do not have a mailing list. I don't keep track of anybody's addresses. And as soon as I'm done with them, they're out. So definitely, if you're interested in getting a sticker, and, a couple of people reached out to me and they're like, well, you sent me a sticker, but then I had to turn that computer in. So can I have another sticker, please? And the answer is always yes. And now a word from our official sponsor, Capstone. Capstone is an innovative publisher and education technology provider of children's content for school libraries, classrooms, and at-home learning. Home of the award-winning PebbleGo research database, Capstone has a passion for creating inspired learning and intellectual curiosity in children, and I am so excited to be working with them. Friends, I am so grateful to Capstone for their continued commitment to support the podcast in Season 5. They are offering listeners of School Librarians United a very special discount. Visit shop.capstonepub.com and use the code UNITED to get $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and Capstone interactive ebooks. That's code UNITED for $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and ebooks on shop.capstonepub.com. And now, for today's episode, tables are turned and my conversation with Penny Walch. Friends, I'm so excited. Penny Walch, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. How are you today?
I'll tell you what, Penny, I am so excited about this conversation. Friends, this is a one of a kind. We've never tried this before, but here we go. Penny came to me, about, a couple months ago. It was after the new year, maybe?
Yep.
And said, I have a great idea if you're interested. And I'm going to let Penny sort of explain her inspiration, but because I'm on board for anything. And Penny and I, we go back a long ways. We actually crossed paths in Season 1. She has been on several episodes. First episode 93 in October of 2020, New Zealand School Librarian. And then again, 1 year later, round 1, Can I Just Vent, episode 145. She is responsible for quite a bit of New Zealand talent talent being featured on the podcast. And so I'm so grateful to have a friend in New Zealand. It was one of the exciting things when we stumbled across one another. But Penny, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm absolutely terrified. What we're doing today is we're turning the tables on Amy. And so just as a little nod to the fact that I'm in New Zealand, I want to introduce, I guess, with a little te reo Māori, which te reo in Māori means the language, with a sort of a bit of a greeting, which is kind of traditional in New Zealand. So I'm going to, and I'm British, so my te reo is not perfect, but I do want to do this little nod to it. So I'll do some te reo, I'll do a little welcome, and then I will explain what it is in English. So here we go. And apologies to any New Zealand listeners who are out there. Tēnā koutou, e mihi ana ki ngā mana whenua, ko Penny toku ingoa, no kirikiri roa Hamilton aho, e mahi anō o he kaiako whare puka puka ki Southall School, no reira tēnā koutou katoa, which basically means greetings to everybody. I'm acknowledging the land, the people of the land. My name is Penny, I'm from Hamilton, and I'm a teacher librarian at Southall School, and welcome again, which is basically, that's what I've just said. So, hi Amy.
Hi, Penny. A first for the podcast. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to be a guest on my own show.
Your own podcast.
On my own show. And I couldn't ask for a more friendly audience and a lovely host. Penny and I cross paths probably weekly on Twitter, and really was one of the first opportunities I had to appreciate just how valuable a platform could be in uniting the interests and the concerns and the voices of school librarians and teacher librarians around the world.
Absolutely. So, but today, as I said, the tables are being turned on you, Amy. It is your turn to be in the spotlight. And hopefully this isn't too painful for you as you listen to me stumble my way through. So welcome to your own podcast. And if I may, I just want to tell your listeners how this came about, if that's okay. So I walk a lot, which is a dangerous thing because when I walk, I often listen to podcasts and they get me thinking. So like I said, that's dangerous. Thinking in my brain is always dangerous. I come up with, crazy ideas. So I was out in January, I think, listening to your podcast, and this idea just kind of jumped out of nowhere. I thought somebody needs to interview Amy. So instead of the sensible thing to do, which was to sleep on the idea and, ponder it and maybe think about it a little bit further the next day, I grabbed my phone, which I always have when I'm out walking, and started penning an email, which is also dangerous because one day I'm going to walk into a lamppost. I do this all the time when I'm out walking. I'm constantly on my phone writing down ideas. So not only did I pen the email to Amy, to you, I also hit send, which was like, wow, what have I done? And the idea was, in my mind, that someone who knew Amy well and probably was American should interview her. I thought it was a great idea. I suggested your husband, as well as some librarians who've been on the show a few times. And I gathered from your email back to me that your husband was less than keen. And what did he say?
I don't think he even formed words. I believe he laughed. I believe that was a knee slapper. The response from him was a look of absolute confusion, and I believe there were some expletives uttered, and I took that as a no.
So that wasn't a good idea. Poor man. Then you got back to me and you suggested that I do the interview, which was never on the agenda in my book, but it was like, what? Never the intention. But I was impulsive enough to send that email. So I thought, well, maybe I should put my money where my mouth is. And so plans were made. And today we are finally here. Sunday morning for me, Saturday night for you. So thank you very much. Like I said, this is terrifying, but exciting. I've never properly interviewed anyone before, and certainly not on a podcast. So I'm going to apologise in advance for my technique, the ums and ahs, which actually I'm hoping you're going to edit out. One of the things I admire about you is your interview style, and everything flows so naturally. So we may be in for a rocky ride today. Who knows? We'll see. Before we start for real, I just want to take an opportunity to thank the following people for their inputs. So people who got in touch with me. Shelley Keppeler, I'm hoping I get that name right, at Madison's Library, at Mrs. Daly MLIS, at Catherine Ryan, and my colleague, Julie Huggins. So let's start this episode in the same way that you start all of your episodes. Tell us a little bit about the library that you currently work in.
I am a high school librarian in Metro Detroit. My high school is, probably about a half an hour drive from my home. I mentioned before that it takes me less time to get to Canada than it does to get to my job. So I drive about 30 minutes west of where I live. And my high school is a public high school in a small district. And we have one middle school, one high school, and several elementary schools. My current enrollment is 1,350. I have about 85 teachers and all total about 110 staff, including our supports and all sorts of people who also work in the building. And I'm on a fully flexible schedule. Most days I get to work by 7 a.m. My Learning Commons, it's called a Learning Commons, and I actually don't have the title of librarian. This is where I start to feel a little fraudulent. I am the job I interviewed was for a Learning Commons. That's not unusual. A lot of our spaces have been sort of renamed or given the name of Learning Commons to become a larger sort of concept in design and purpose, in moving away from the idea of a library. But my particular title, it was rather confusing because I didn't apply for the job because the word library and librarian aren't part of it. But I am an information research technology specialist. And it's a little confusing. The job was sort of languishing and nobody was applying for it. And a girlfriend of mine said, "Hey, why isn't anybody applying for this job?" I said, "Well, maybe because the word library isn't in it and the word librarian isn't in it." And that is, has created some concerns because it does mean that our jobs can become rather convoluted. I do fill in all the gaps. I do a large number of jobs which nobody else does. There are days that I think I just am a glorified bouncer, keeping control of which kids are where and who's going to be in the space and who's not. Friday, I actually covered a class. We were short on substitute teachers. So one of my classrooms had a class with no teacher. I was the teacher, but I could see them, so I knew they weren't going anywhere. Sometimes all I'm doing is helping other people do their jobs. That's largely what I do. I have an incredibly modest collection. The space went for almost 10 years without a certified school librarian in it. And without a certified school librarian in it, there wasn't the drive to build and support a collection. It had been moved from being a traditional library space to being a Learning Commons. And in that design, which was done by somebody who was not a school librarian, the emphasis was on furniture, and there was very little regard for supporting a print collection. And so right now, I'm working diligently to rectify that. I've applied for some grants, but I'm currently sitting on a collection of 4,200 books, which averages about 2 books per student, which is shameful. So we all have things that we're struggling with. For me, it's a budget. For me, it's the collection, and with an average age of 2002. So I like a challenge. I do. I like a challenge. And I think we always find ourselves in situations where those sort of glaring issues that become the top priority for us. So as much as I would love to collaborate with my teachers, and a lot of my prioritization, a lot of what I have put out there first and foremost is trying to advocate and for the building of that print collection and building that reading culture, because it is almost wholly absent.
Which which is fundamental, isn't it? It's like so fundamental. It's so interesting listening to you talk about that, because I think something I've learned, I think I'm in my 7th or 8th years librarianing, is that every librarian has a completely different story of what they have to do. You know, a teacher seems to be a teacher. I've been a teacher as well. And it's quite clear what a teacher does, whereas a librarian in each school has a different job description, idea of what a librarian is. And sometimes I wonder whether that's part of our struggle to be heard, to be understood, for sure. Yeah, and you're obviously no different. That's a very small collection you've got.
Well, and I think the wonderful thing is that when I have the benefit of talking to as many people as I do, while I see so many amazing, successful programs, I recognize that every person I've ever met has had those struggles in their own space, sort of fill in the blank, whatever that struggle has been, whether it's been funding or scheduling, or, you know, once upon a time I was traveling every day to multiple buildings, and that was a struggle. So there's always something that we have to work through. And I certainly saw this opportunity to we want to improve wherever we are. We want to improve the space that we're in, and make sure that we make a difference in the space that we're in. And I'll tell you what, it was not hard to improve upon a place that I found myself occupying, because my predecessor was not a school librarian. And I felt very warmly received by my staff, because when they understood, oh, you're a school librarian, now there's a chance we're gonna really build this place and create a space that we so richly deserve.
And isn't that great that your teachers recognise that your school needed this, which is very cool. That doesn't always happen.
I will be the first to say that my principal's decision to hire me was largely driven by our ELA team, our English Language Arts team, which was really pushing for a certified school librarian, because my job could have also been filled by somebody with an educational technology certificate, which is disheartening. But it is this idea that they would have taken either or, and my teachers lobbied for somebody who would build that culture of reading.
Wow, amazing. And just on the same but different, just on the subject of spaces, just thinking about now the podcast, can you describe where you're recording from? Are you in some highfalutin flash-ass studio, or where are you recording from at the moment?
I'm in my childhood bedroom. So, this is amateur hour. So, my family moved into this house when I was 11, the summer I turned 12. And, I lived here until I went to the university, when I was 18 years old, and, never really thought I would ever find my way back into my old childhood bedroom. And my life took all its turns, and I got married 27 years ago, and 3 children later. And we, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with a fairly aggressive Alzheimer's, and she had been living here by herself. And my father had passed on probably 5 years before that. And so she was here alone, and my siblings and I sort of had some interesting conversations, and realized that, one of us could easily move into the house that we grew up in, and I only lived about a mile away. So my family and I, my 3 children, my husband, our 2 dogs, we picked up and we moved back home to take care of my mom. And that was 10 years ago. And we lived a multi-generational household. Friends, if you've never considered doing this, it was the best thing I could have done. My children grew up as as early teens and into their teenage years, taking care of their grandmother, who was in decline. Becoming more and more empathetic to the needs of my mother, whose health was failing. She died in July of 2020. And obviously we stayed here. We never left. This is where we will live now. And but it was a wonderful decision at the time, and I will never regret the risk you take in deciding to combine households, to live with a family member who is in decline. It's a very, friends, if any of you find yourself in this situation, you want to talk one day, just reach out to me, because I've got a half an hour drive home. I'll be happy to tell you all about living with somebody who has Alzheimer's. But, I will just pivot and selfishly say this podcast, you guys didn't know, because I chose to keep the podcast a space that is free of a lot of things. I share a few details about myself. I did not share the fact that my mother was dying. I did not share the fact that, I keep it fairly free of things like politics, and I really want to reserve this space to celebrate school librarians. And it has always been, and has been since the inception in 2018, has been my space that was truly one that I could create and control.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's amazing, because that would have been in the middle of COVID that your mum passed away. Wow, that must have been very tough. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what. The silver lining was we were already home. I didn't have to take leave. We could be present for her and she died at home. She died. We had hospice come in and support us. And so, friends, again, if any listeners are like finding themselves in similar circumstances and you'd like to talk as I drive my half an hour home, just, reach out to the podcast. I'll be happy to give you any ideas of support that I can provide.
COVID did actually have some silver linings. You're right. Amazing. Okay. So, I first discovered your podcast, I think we've talked about this, we're not quite sure, but I think it was New Zealand summer of 2019. And I was out walking and I became obsessed with listening to every single episode. And in fact, some of them I listened to more than once, because I'm terrible. I'm like a goldfish, and I have to have things go through my brain twice, maybe even 3 times before it actually sticks. I love the fact that there was a nice balance between stuff that I already knew and was already doing, so it wasn't too overwhelming, and also new stuff which helped me to move forward as a librarian. Your style was so easy to listen to, and it honestly, truly felt like that you were talking to me and me alone. I love listening to you wax lyrical about all things library, and as a relatively new librarian at the time, it was really an absolute lifesaver, and free PD, which my husband loves because he's in charge of the PD at the school I work at. So all my PD has been pretty much free, or a lot of it has. So, so that's quite a cute little story. So I guess my question is this. How and when did the idea for starting a podcast come from? Is it something that percolated and bubbled for some time, or was it a flash of inspiration that hit you like a bolt of lightning? How did it happen?
Well, I started listening to podcasts this would have been now about 11 years ago. We were getting ready to move into this house to take care of my mother, and we were going to be painting our rooms. This house has been occupied by our family since 1981. And my husband said, "Oh, when you go over to the house, you can listen to some podcasts." I said, "What's that?" And so that was 11 years ago. And my husband said, "Oh, well, let me just pick some things for you." And he picked out a podcast called Stuff You Missed in History Class. I was a former history teacher, and he said, "You'll really like this because you like history." And I just binged all these episodes. They still come out with new content all the time. And I had this moment. I was like, well, I'm really frustrated because what I want to do is learn how to do my job. I said, where was this podcast when I was teaching history? Because if I were teaching history right now, then my students would be listening to these podcasts. My students would be recording their own, history podcast episodes. And I thought, well, this is, what I really, really could use at this point in my career is something that would teach me on how to be a school librarian. So of course you start doing that search and you start using your podcast app and you're typing in the words, librarian, school librarian, libraries. And I was coming up with a lot of public library content. I was coming up with a lot of content for books, learning about different literature, children's lit, middle grade lit, and YA lit, things that were done through publishers, but also enthusiasts. I did not see anything about being a school librarian. And, wow, I think I had also at the same time sort of hit a spot in my career and in the particular job I had. And friends know I've described this job. I worked in 9 schools in 7 years, 4 at a time. And there was no control over my job. There was no control over my schedule. And because I was raising children and my mother was in decline, quitting was not a possibility. 10 years ago, quitting my job was not a possibility. I was unhappy. My husband said, something's got to change. And I sort of had this realization that what I really wanted was a conversation about, I wanted that deep dive about being a school librarian. If any of you listen to National Public Radio, sometimes they talk about those driveway moments when you're listening to the radio and you're not going into the house because you need to finish the conversation that you're listening to on the radio before you can go into the house. So those driveway moments. And I found I was having those driveway moments with myself, which is dumb, but I was ranting. Sometimes the children were in the car. Sometimes they're like, Mom, we can hear you. And, but I'd be sitting in the car just fuming about something or just spinning, trying to flush out what I could do better about something that bothered me that day. I didn't have anybody I could talk to about it. And then, we go into one of these Michigan winters, and this would have been, winter, January, February of 2018. Terrible winters. I think we had a couple polar vortexes, a couple, -40 wind chills. I know that doesn't mean I'm not going to convert into Celsius, but it was colder in Michigan than it was in parts of Antarctica and the North Pole. I mean, it was just wretched. So we're inside, and when you're inside for weeks on end, all of a sudden a little idea can really pick up momentum. And really pick up momentum. And I sat down and I said, well, what if I had a podcast about my husband, I'm sure at one point said, well, why don't you just do a podcast about school librarians if you can't find one? And, you of course say, oh, that's dumb. No, that's too much work. But, I think a lot of listeners right now, they can relate to that need to make lists. And I started making lists. And I think in one sitting, I came up with maybe 25, 30 episode ideas and, realizing I had some obstacles. But the fact is that content was not going to be a problem. Technology was going to be a problem. Technology was going to be that hurdle. So I created the podcast actually on March 31st of 2018. That's when it acquired a Google Drive of its own. And friends, if you have a Google Drive that's committed to something outside of you professionally. So I had my personal Gmail, I had my work Gmail, and then I had this thing called the podcast, and it was a podcast email. And I started doing all that research to try and fill in the gaps. And because, librarians, we research, reached out to some of my favorite podcasters. I reached out to people who hosted podcasts to try and figure out what I would need to do. And I'm blown away by the fact that Penny was listening to me when I was absolutely at my very sort of beginnings. I was a baby podcaster. You heard me at my most vulnerable. I felt, and the best advice somebody gave me was, would you do this if nobody was listening? And if the answer is yes, then you're on to something. Because you cannot possibly be doing this for any big ideas. You have to sort of drill down and recognize the reason why you have a podcast is because you want to have a podcast. And that's it. That's how it got started.
So I'm not sure whether you answered I've got a little question here from Shelley Kepler, who asked what your family's reaction was. Was it like, you go honey, or was it, oh my gosh, she's crazy? I'm suspecting it was more like the you go honey end of the spectrum.
My family's reaction when I said, I think I'm going to have a podcast, was always supportive. I think it was tempered. I think that their enthusiasm was one that was, we want mom to be happy. And if this is something that makes mom happy, then we want mom to be happy. And I think that it is, when it comes to hobbies, podcasting is a relatively safe venture. My last time I had a hobby was when the children were very small, and I said I wanted to run a marathon. And my husband was on board. He said, "Oh, sure. You want to run a marathon? All right. What do we need to do?" And a couple pairs of shoes and some babysitting. I managed to get some people to watch the kids, because you can't bring three kids on your long runs. And I actually ran 4 marathons and many half marathons. And that was something that I did for myself. And so my next hobby was, I wanted a podcast. And I think they knew that the important thing was that they supported me in that this was something that was important to me. If I was saying it out loud, it meant that I had clearly put some thought into it.
There's definitely something about that saying things out loud, isn't it? It's like, I'm actually thinking that you and I are it's really interesting listening to you, because I also, one of the things I've wanted to do for a long time was to run a marathon. No, not run. I don't run, walk a marathon. And for a number of years, my husband was like, yeah, right. Because he knows that I don't do that sort of thing. But anyway, I came home one day, this was in 2018, I think. And I said, I'm going to do that marathon. And he could tell in my eyes that it was going to happen. So I did. I walked a marathon. I also, like you, me and my colleague decided we were going to do a podcast. And as you know, I asked for your advice on that. And we did start a podcast. Unfortunately, my lovely colleague, Julie, has not been so well. So it's kind of floundered a little bit, but we're definitely keen to get it back up and running again. So it's quite funny. Maybe that's one of the reasons that I connected with some of the things you were saying, is it's like, there's a real relatability about, what you're talking about. Obviously the fact that we're librarians as well. Definitely. So I think you probably alluded to my next question, but maybe if you could just go into a little bit deeper. I was thinking it's all very well having this idea to start a podcast, which, I've done as well. You go, oh, this is a great idea. But there's quite a leap between having the idea and actually making that idea come to life. So what did that look like for you? You've alluded to the fact that, equipment was a problem. Did it take you long to get it started? Practical considerations, what had to happen?
Well, and I think you have to recognize that it isn't going to be perfect. A year later, I think 2019, I met a lovely librarian named Tracy Chun, who shared with me the phrase "brave before perfect." And I'm like, oh, that was me last year. I recognized that when this was going to come out, that it wasn't fully formed. The podcast in its infancy was going to look one way, but there was always room for growth. There was always going to be this expectation that moving forward, it would have to change. It would have to grow. And my job would be to see how I could best channel the resources that I had. For me, my strength was content. I was not shaky on that. I felt very confident about content. What I lacked in understanding the technology, there was a learning curve. It was real steep. I'm YouTube trained in that winter when I was starting to wrestle with how this would all take shape. I really did watch a lot of videos. I had entire folders of blog posts on, how to create your own podcast. And they said some things again and again. And that was, content, that, don't obsess about your technology. Don't obsess about your sound equipment or your editing, because the only thing that truly matters in a podcast is content. And that is what will kill a podcast, not its sound quality. And when I recognized the formula I had in mind was keeping this space entirely for and by school librarians, that is a formula that has never changed. To make sure that this stays a space that is completely dedicated to the art of being a school librarian. And I've said repeatedly, I will never run out of episode ideas because school librarians are phenomenal people. We are magic in this respect, that we recognize that what we do should be shared so that others can learn from us. And that is it's an absolute opportunity to then shine that light on guests who come onto the show to make sure that what they're doing can also be in some way replicated around the world in other libraries and to raise that profile of what we do. And so, I recognize that first year was going to be a little cringy. But never at any point did I say, no, this is painful. No, I wanted to move to that next place where I could start interviewing guests. And so what I did was that summer of 2019, I went to a very large ed tech conference to learn from more podcasters and talk to them. I really sort of set my sights on connecting with as many school librarians to see if they would like to be guests on my show, which is exactly why that fall of 2019, I sort of, season 2, the goal was we're going to have guests on this show. And that was very an important pivot because for those of you who have listened to season 1, that's hard. It's a lot of writing. I don't like to write. It's not my strength. I have the gift of gab. And I do have the gift of gab. I would vastly prefer talking to other school librarians and using this opportunity to share what they do and what they want to, share with listeners. And that's where I decided very early on, that was the beginning of season 2. This was we're going to have those deep dives.
Just other thing that Shelley just wondered, and I hadn't thought about this, was when you first started into your podcasting, did you tell your admin? Were they aware? Because obviously, it's going to take some time. So that's going to take time away from other stuff maybe. So were they supportive? Did they know?
I went to, and this would have been back in the spring of 2018. So before I had any episodes come out. So again, part of my homework was trying to figure out how I could do this and not jeopardize my job. And that's vitally important. So I actually, before I had even published one episode, I was still the spring of 2018. I went to my tech director, my technology director, who is in our central office. So this is somebody who works closely with, in the United States, we have a superintendent, assistant superintendents, and so forth. And I went to the tech director personally. I said, hey, I'd like to start a podcast. I listen to other ed tech podcasts. I listen to other educator podcasts. I want to make sure I do this and I don't jeopardize my job. And honestly, all this was just a conversation. I just said, what do I need to do to make sure that I don't jeopardize my job? And he basically said, it's my tweets are my own equivalent. So in much the same way that when we're on our social media, all of us who have personal social media have created something to the effect, my tweets are my own. I made sure that in every episode built in is a disclaimer that applies to anybody who's on the show, whether you're a guest or you're somebody who's written to the podcast. I do what I can to make sure to respect my guests' privacy. I always, almost always, unless they say, yeah, use my last name. I've always used a first name only and location. Many school librarians would prefer we not use our school names. I don't use my school names. Now, it doesn't take a detective to figure out the name of my school. You can certainly do that, but on the podcast, you're not going to hear me reference my school. And the job that I'm currently in, it's on my CV. So my podcast is part of my CV. It is and has always been something which my administrators see as leadership in the profession. So most of my evaluations, while I may not score high in some categories, the leadership in the profession is one which I've always excelled. And I don't hide the fact that I have a podcast. When I interviewed for the job I have right now, they saw it in my CV, and then they were able to ask me any questions about it before I was hired.
Okay, so you've already alluded to the fact that season 2, you started getting guests onto the podcast, and that just took things to the next level. That must have been another quite a big and daunting step. And obviously you already had plenty of connections, or you said that you're building up connections in library land. But how do you go about actually getting the people onto the show? Do you have to go searching, or do you have people jumping up and down and yelling, pick me, pick me? A bit like what I did, I guess.
Yeah. Season 2 was a little touch and go. Season 2 was a little touch and go. If I met you at ISTE 19, there was a very good chance you got an email from me. I got very good at cold calling. I call it cold calling, but when you just reach out to somebody, I know, when people are in sales and they're trying to sell something, when they call somebody randomly out of the blue, that's cold calling.
Yeah.
I usually had an excuse. So we have several professional magazines, and if I had read an article you had written, then I might reach out to you and say, hey, I saw you wrote this article for this magazine. Would you like to talk about that topic on my show? That happened a lot. And then library Twitter was a huge save for me because, for example, you and I would DM on Twitter. Never mind the fact that there's half a world between us. I think you're 15 hours ahead of me. I think that's what it is. Yeah. I think you're 15 hours ahead of me, but we could be I'm like, oh, Penny's on, and we'll just start messaging on Twitter. And it was that ability to connect was made easy by social media. I didn't have Facebook until I had a podcast. Actually, I had sort of managed to not go on Facebook for a long time. And then when I realized that there were people on Facebook that I might be able to connect with and interview, that was another way that I sort of built that social media, that virtual PLN. And so when people followed me, being able to interview them for the show was another opportunity that I sort of offered. It does require a lot of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I don't have a team. I don't have a scheduler. I don't have anybody helping me with my sound or my post-production. It is honestly a lot of hustle. So when somebody, I know, couple fun ones. Lucas Maxwell, who is he's in London. Yeah, he's in London. And, I just saw he did this fantastic, all I'd have to do is see like one tweet. And sometimes that was all I needed. And I just reached out. I followed them. They followed me. And then I sent out an invitation. A good example, Lucas Maxwell put out a tweet that actually had it was a series of 14 tweets on how to raise the profile of your school library. That was the outline. It was actually our second episode that we did together. And all I did was I looked at this one day. I was reading his tweets. I was like, oh, he goes on. There's like 14 ways to raise the profile of your school library. That's the episode.
I remember that episode.
Yeah,
I like listening to him. He's good.
No, it's a lot of fun. And, really all I was looking for was somebody who felt passionately about what they do and they were willing to share it. And sometimes it was just it was frustration. You could tell people on social media were venting to other school librarians about something that just was so challenging, or it was something that they were wrestling with. And I'm like, that's a great conversation. Would you like to be on my show? And then from that point on, once they said yes, then everything got kicked into high gear.
On the subject of guests, is there anyone that you haven't interviewed that you'd love to talk to? So I guess a dream interviewee. Is there anyone or a couple of people that you'd like to interview?
Well, I will say and she knows she's my virtual mentor, but Margaret Sullivan was a dream interview for me. She had written a very incredible blog post about the thief of joy, that when we compare ourselves to others.
That's my husband's catchphrase. Yeah.
Yes. Because when we compare and despair. And so for me, Margaret was somebody who I just looked up to, and she didn't even know it. And so when I was able to interview her, that was a huge win. And
in terms of someone you haven't interviewed, though, is there anyone that you'd like to interview?
I've been really, really fortunate. I will be honest, the other huge win for me professionally was Elizabeth Hutchinson.
Oh, she's amazing.
And Elizabeth Hutchinson, when I was just in season 1 and I had started to create, those were the two people I wanted to interview, because they were the two people who, for me, represented somebody whose passion went beyond what they did day to day and had that impact on others. And so I held them out as examples of people I wanted to do.
She gave me time. I had a conversation with her online in the UK. Of this, I think it was in the middle of COVID, and things all went to pot after that. But I'm still wanting to develop some of the stuff that she does. She's amazing.
No, and I
couldn't agree more.
I've really been very, very fortunate. I actually don't look that far out ahead of where I am. I have a running list of people who've spoken to me. I've spoken to them. They've said, hey, let's get together in a couple weeks. Let's get together in a couple months. For me, my goal is always content, but it's also about trying to reach as many voices as possible who haven't been on the show. So I've interviewed librarians in over 30 states, which means there's still 20 states I haven't interviewed. You've got, there's a lot of the United States I haven't been able to reach yet. And so for me, it's not so much one person I want to interview, but rather interviewing school librarians in parts of the country I haven't connected with, in parts of the world I haven't connected with. So I have interviewed somebody in Ghana. I have interviewed in New Zealand, obviously, and Australia and Great Britain and Canada and the UK. But there's still a lot of the world I'd love to interview. So for me, it's not so much a single person as it is geographic, to be able to showcase and put the spotlight on school librarians and their lived experiences. Because that is where there's so much value in being able to just press record and share those conversations.
That makes perfect sense. So sort of linked to that, and this is actually a really awful, horrible question. It's almost going to be, I'm going to ask you it's almost the equivalent of choose your favourite child. Do you have a favourite episode, an episode that's spoken to you perhaps a little bit more than any other episode, or that, I don't know, it's just hit you in the feels, whatever?
For me, what I love doing are listener requests. So, and I'm very, very aware when somebody has come to me and said, hey, could you do an episode on fill in the blank? And all of a sudden, I now have a mission. I'm out there. I'm like, you know what? You're right. We need to do this episode. And all of a sudden I get blinders on. I can't see anything else but what that listener wants. A good example of this would be when listeners reach out and say, hey, I'm remodeling my library. Could you haven't done an episode on remodeling, the library space yet. Could you do one on remodeling the library space? And again, blinders on. I'm like, I have no idea what I'm going to do. But I was getting ready to take off. And when you are on the plane, you're supposed to put your phone on airplane mode. And so I sent a tweet out when I was still on the tarmac in Detroit. Hey, would anybody like to, has anybody ever been part of a renovation plan? Would you like to talk about that experience on my podcast? Put send out the tweet, and I put my phone in airplane mode. And then we spend 2.5 hours in the air, and we land, and we're driving out to see my daughter, and I'm so excited. And when I had a moment to look at my messages, I had like 12 people who wanted to be on the show. I was like, well, oh my, no, wait. I was like, what am I supposed to do now? I was like, oh, wait. We can do something about this. We actually have an episode with and it turns out I figured out a way to invite all of them onto the show. I said, you got 10 minutes each to talk about your experiences. And this was a really fun episode. Number one, because it was a listener request. And I know whenever one person requests an episode, there's at least 5 other people who'd love to listen to that particular episode. So for me, those are really fun episodes because I know there is an audience out there who's going to listen to this. And then the fact that I had 9 people, we got it to the point where we actually, no, let me back that up. I extended invitations out to these librarians, and it was this mega episode. It's close to 2 hours long, but it's a great compilation of all these different lived experiences of school librarians and what they learned from being involved or not involved in the renovation process. And it was a really fun episode to do, and I'm really proud of it because while it was a lot of work, to me it really did answer the request of the listener. And that's something that I sometimes struggle with. I want to make sure that the content has listeners out there. And selfishly, it doesn't have to be a lot of people who want to hear this episode, but I gave up on the idea that every episode would apply to every listener. Gave up on that. It's not going to happen. I also recognize that there are some episodes that are not always going to be relevant. I have 14 episodes that were recorded between April of 2020 and April of 2021. And if we never listen to those episodes again, I'll be fine because they almost all started with the word virtual, remote, distance. It was all pandemic. It was, and we have one episode that has continued to still be 1 or 2 because many of us do virtual job interviews. Courtney Pentland did that episode because we recognized that during the immediate pandemic and then the year after that and the year after that, that everybody was going to have some component of a virtual interview, a job interview. And that one still gets a lot of listens, but I'll tell you, the idea of revisiting those days of teaching remotely, it really is triggering. One of my listeners reached out and said, "Hey, Amy, I hope you're okay with me not listening to all the pandemic episodes because they're very triggering." Those are very triggering episodes for me. And it's because it was, again, like in the spring of 2020, every conference was canceled for the next year. But we kept on having that's when we kicked it into full gear. That's when I had weekly episodes because we were working remotely. All of us were stuck. None of us knew what we were doing. And all of a sudden there was a whole lot of content, which I knew we would not need in the future, but we needed now.
There'd be amazing historical, back in 100 years' time, people can go back and listen to those episodes as a historical thing. Oh my goodness.
Those were some dark days.
They were.
But the remarkable thing was that we had all these school librarians who said, you know what? I think I found a solution and I'm happy to share it with your listeners. We had 14 episodes like that. We were still able to continue to do these wonderful conversations about doing our jobs, which did not somehow also encompass the pandemic. But there were 14 specifically in that calendar year that really, I know, helped a lot of us through some of those struggles that we all shared of being librarians. If
nothing else, like, I listened to those going, oh, thank goodness I'm not the only one who's struggling to know what to do. It was you're right, dark times. It's interesting you say that you don't, you can't, you're right, have every episode is not going to be for every person. And yet I pretty much every episode I listen to, there will be one nugget. I can go into an episode looking at the heading going, this is going to have nothing for me. I'm just going to listen to this for, just for fun because I love the podcast. But every time there'll be something that I just go, the smallest little thing sometimes. So, you're hitting a mark, definitely. If, like you say, if you're hitting me, then you're hitting hundreds of other people as well. So,
well, and you're right, because sometimes in the conversations, we've now moved to about an hour long episodes. Our episodes are at least an hour long. And I'll tell you, when I was writing them during season 1, I was lucky if I could get 20 minutes. It was just me, myself, and I. It was a real slog. It was hard work, but the wonderful thing is that you're right. There are oftentimes these sort of tangential, we sort of go off in left field. We start to talk about something that's related. Good example, last week we talked about packing up our libraries, and I was talking to Harry Koffel, but we also did this sort of mini segment on weeding, because weeding is something you can easily do while you're packing up a collection to move into another space. And so while it was an episode about packing up, there were also pieces of it that if you were weeding, you would also pick up some great tips and tricks there as well.
Totally. So you do allude, most episodes, I think you allude to your gratitude for your guests, and, you thank them and all that sort of stuff. But what have been some of your biggest takeaways from your guests? I guess I'm asking, what do you get from the podcast? It sounds like a bit of an obvious question, but is there something you can pinpoint? What does it do for you?
Well, I'll tell you what, it doesn't matter what kind of day I have at work. It doesn't, because when I know I'm going to be sitting down at night, usually with a glass of wine, sometimes a cocktail, or sometimes it's just, an iced tea. But I know the high point of my day is connecting with another school librarian. And it really doesn't matter how challenging that day was. It doesn't matter what was going on. Even during the summertime, I crave that long form interview, sort of that deep dive into a topic. And there is something so freeing about talking to somebody who, in many respects, is a complete stranger, but we have so much in common right from the get-go in terms of professionally. And, in preparing to do that conversation, I've learned a lot about the people that I'm going to be interviewing. It is for me that ability to connect with a school librarian and have that deep dive, but know that other people are going to benefit from that conversation as well, because that to me is what motivates me to do this now every single week. Because when we press record, and that's a very big ask, to say, hey, I'd love to pick your brain about something. You wrote this great article. You did this presentation. I'd love to talk with you. Oh, and by the way, I want to press record and share it with anybody who wants to listen. That's a big ask. Not everybody's on board. And so when you realize the generosity of the other person in that conversation, and remembering that the listeners are there too. So I get to do something that's terribly intrusive. I get to ask you questions of all sorts. And I'm doing so because I'm thinking all the while that if I were listening to this conversation, I've got to think about what those questions would be that other people would be asking if they could join the conversation as well.
I love that you use the word connection, because I think that's sort of the fundamental thing about being a librarian is trying to make those connections all the time. So that's, great word. So you said that, every episode's about an hour long. And like I know from having embarked on podcasting myself that an hour long episode represents a lot more time and energy than that. How much time do you invest in each episode and a vague sort of process from go to woe for one episode? Maybe what are your biggest challenges in amongst that? I presume time is probably a big challenge.
So I no longer run marathons. When you run marathons, you really don't have room for other hobbies. If you have a weekly podcast, you don't have other hobbies.
I do wonder whether you have more hours in the day than the rest of us. Is that the case? Oh. I don't know. How
I
do you
don't watch much TV. I don't watch TV.
Okay.
I watch very little TV. It is, when I tell people it's about 10 hours a week, it's a 10-hour a week commitment. The conversation obviously is about a 90. You and I will be on for at least 90 minutes. We exchanged, what would you say, 7 or 8 emails about this. You and I exchanged 7 or 8 emails, and those are easy. Those are quick. A lot of those get knocked out before work, during work, after work. But all in, when I do my research on the person I'm learning about, that really, and that's fun though. You have to understand, I love learning about
like
what other people do.
It's your hobby, isn't it? And hobbies are meant to be fun. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, this is where I love it. So, but it's about a 10-hour commitment each week. So in addition to our hour-long conversation, the research that we've done, writing the outlines. So my guests know I will give them an outline, usually of 10 to 15 questions. Those are all based on, perhaps I've read your book. An episode that I'm doing this next week is on a guest of mine, and I read their book. So consider the fact that I also had to read their book. Sometimes it's a dissertation. There have been a handful of PhD, doctoral candidates, and so forth. People who and I'll take a look at their PhD dissertations. Ooh, that's hard. But if I read your book, throw in that time, and the trade-off is those outlines tend to go very, very quickly because it's loosely based on the book. But each episode for me, I'm not very good at editing. I'm slow at it, and so recording the bumper takes at least half an hour. And then editing the episode will take a total of at least 4 hours. So
that's a big deal.
The results you get are instantaneous. I mean, this is my dopamine. You want to talk about dopamine? Podcasting dopamine is probably very similar to watching, like if you ever see people who are video game addicts and they watch those tallies go up. Podcasters have a similar dopamine effect when we look at, we can look at the analytics. We can look at the stats. If you've ever been on my show, I'll get in touch with you in about 12 hours. Say, hey, your episode's been out for 12 hours, and this is how many U.S. states you've reached. This is how many countries you've reached. If you're having a bad day and you've been on my show, reach out to me and I will tell you, because the podcast gets, I say we, because I'm never doing these episodes by myself. And when you recognize that the podcast is a resource that people can tap for free. It is 24 hours, 7 days a week. It is free, customizable, convenient, professional development, as you said. And so on any given day, between 90 and 125 different episodes are downloaded. So that is how evergreen the episodes are, is that it doesn't matter what time of the year it is. It doesn't matter where you are in your school year. School librarians are always looking for ways to improve on what we do. So it might be you're on holiday. It might be that you're on vacation. It might be that you're taking a road trip and you're listening to podcasts, or you're just getting ready for work, or you are just, driving home. But listening to a podcast is a wonderful opportunity to do that reflection on your own practice. And so for me, like, all I do is I press record, and then other people can benefit from this conversation. And that to me is the reward, because I get that fan mail. I hear back from people. I hear back from people who say, Amy, I got the job and I listened to your episodes to get ready, and I'm so excited, or I've decided to become a librarian because I listened to your podcast. You're not going to find a more authentic way to experience what we do every day from people who experience it firsthand than you would just by tuning into an episode of the podcast.
That must be pretty cool, actually. Yeah, getting the feedback. That's amazing. And I'm just wondering whether my next question may be obsolete, but I'm going to try it anyway. There must be some weeks, that you don't feel like you have the energy. You might be feeling unwell, or you've had a busy week at work. Has there ever been any time when you've just gone, stuff it all, I am packing this in, I'm not doing it anymore? And obviously at this point you're still doing it. So what have you done to get remotivated, or do you just not get demotivated?
I've never lost my motivation. I have seized on opportunities to record people well in advance. So this past January, not only did I record all of January's episodes, I also recorded all of February's episodes in January. And I did it because I knew that there would come a time when I just got too busy. And I just felt like you sort of have to strike when the iron's hot. And so for me, getting motivated, where it can be a little bit tricky is if my guests' schedules change. And I've had to do a little bit of extra work to make sure I have an episode every Friday. Do I have to have an episode every Friday? Absolutely not. Completely arbitrary. I have sort of created that expectation. It's a momentum I don't like to break. I will say I've learned that nothing new happens between the middle of December and the new year. And I give myself those 3 weeks. And if I wasn't busy with the holidays and family and all those big dinners, and I might sit there and miss being a podcaster. But I tried not podcasting for a little while, and especially during the summer, that I think between season 2 and season 3, I definitely didn't broadcast. I might have taken a couple weeks off, or I took the month of July off. And to me, I got antsy. I missed it.
You're addicted.
It's
an addiction.
There is a high that comes with connecting with people. I'm not lying when I say it is oftentimes the best part of my day. Is the conversation that I have with another school librarian, having those connections, recognizing that if I stop recording for any length of time, that's just pushing back the people that I wanted to interview. And I don't like to do that. I have always wanted to be able to have this, and recognizing that momentum is there. I have now the support of sponsorship. I have people who are willing to pay for me to read ads on my show. And I think that when I have that nod from corporate America, when I have people saying, we will pay you per episode for your content that you're putting out there, all of a sudden I tell people it's kind of like somebody's paying me to go to the gym. When I was a podcaster and I didn't have sponsorship, it's a lot like you have a gym membership. You're going to pay it every month, whether or not you use it. What you get out is what you put in. And if you do nothing, you get nothing. But get a sponsor for your show And all of a sudden that vote of confidence means I'm going to make sure that we're going to be able to have a show every week.
So that segues actually quite nicely into my next little question, and this is embarrassing because it's not really something I'd thought about until starting to think about, asking you some questions, and it kind of tells me that I'm taking what you do for granted, which is for which I apologise actually. So have you ever considered charging listeners or having premium content for your show? Is that something that you think about doing?
You can just all settle down. No. The answer is absolutely not. This is having the podcast in its inception was a lot like any hobby. You sort of set aside in your head the kind of budget that you would set aside to run a marathon, or if you like to scrapbook, or if you like to, I don't know, golf. I mean, you have these hobbies. Yeah, maybe not golf. Golf's.
Yeah, I was going to say that there are people that like golfers.
Golf and sailing. No, this is not.
No, but I'm with you on that.
Yes, but if you happen to like scrapbooking, or if you happen to have a hobby, you sort of set aside that dollar number that you're gonna be like, fine, I'm gonna do this. But never in any iteration of this podcast have I ever fathomed that I would have a paywall or have premium content. I did look into how podcasts sustain themselves, especially ones that want to do more and get better. And I have been very happy with the idea of podcast sponsorship, because it makes more sense to ask corporate America to pay for ad space than to expect any sort of contribution on the part of my listeners. My listeners are the ones who directly benefit from all of these efforts, these energies being spent. And I looked to the podcasts I listen to that I admire most, and it didn't matter what the content was. The fact was they also used sponsorship to make sure that the content was always free, but there was going to be this expectation that there was going to be some ads read in the episodes. And to me, that was a compromise I was willing to live with. I have no problem reading copy for a company that I believe in. If it means that 100% of the content that I put out is always going to be available. What we do is very evergreen. And by the way, I don't pay my guests. If I charged people for my content, then doesn't it stand to reason that I should be paying my guests to be on my show? And I'm not prepared to do that. But I am prepared to allocate some space on my platform for corporate sponsorship. And I feel that's a trade-off that my listeners are willing to be part of that sort of configuration.
I think absolutely right. Yeah. They're probably breathing a sigh of relief right now.
What I think part of that also comes from communicating a lot with my listeners. I've learned over the past 5 years so much from my listeners, whether it's been an email or a DM or a text or a tweet. When people reach out to me and I learn about their circumstances, I realize the people who should be paying for this podcast are not the listeners. It should be some advertising space. And I'll tell you why. I hear from listeners who are just trying to get by paying for graduate school. They are, they can't go to conferences. Their district doesn't have enough money to send them to conferences, but they can listen to the podcast and get their professional development that way. And so that tells me that my listeners are using the podcast in a way that my listeners are listening to the podcast in lieu of oftentimes attending a conference, in lieu of flying somewhere and going to a conference, which, if your district isn't paying for that, it is exorbitantly expensive to go somewhere to get that professional development. Over the summer, I have worked with districts who have asked if they could use the podcast for their professional development. And they would have somebody who had approved, say, 5 hours of professional professional development or 10 hours of professional development. The listeners can then pick which episodes will help build and support their library programs and their areas that they want to grow on. And so it's not unusual for people to reach out to me and say, hey, I listened to you for professional development. And that just means I must be doing something right. Honestly, the first time somebody reached out to me and said, hey, we got to listen to an episode of yours for professional development. Do you have a certificate that I can turn in to my administrator? And I said, I don't, but I will in about an hour. Give me a chance to make one for you. And a big shout out to those school librarians in Texas who were one of the first people to say, yeah, we can listen to your podcast for professional development and we can get this many hours. And so I'm going to listen to these episodes because you helped me, fill in the blank. And so I created a PD certificate that people can, like a digitally editable certificate. But yeah, there are a lot of districts which have recognized that podcasts are free, customizable, and convenient. Why wouldn't you let your teachers have that agency and pick what they're going to learn about? So no, I'm never going to charge the listeners. Absolutely never, never, never. Now, do not be surprised when we have more sponsors come on the show, because the wonderful thing is that we have been able to reach an even wider, more global audience, thanks in large part to corporate sponsorship.
Excellent. So I guess starting to wind it up, got a couple more questions, but in terms of the future, what are your goals for the podcast moving forward? What do you want to see happen next?
I really am excited about featuring more voices from spaces we haven't heard. So reaching around the world, I would love more than anything to do some more interviews outside of the United States, and through areas that are, I just haven't been able to sort of crack into that market. So I look at I have a map of the United States, and I have it indicates where I've done all of these interviews. And then you have these huge spaces in the United States I've never done an interview.
So where do you need people from? Shout out now. Tell these people. Which states do you need?
I've never interviewed anybody in Alaska or Hawaii or Montana or Idaho or South Dakota or Minnesota and Iowa. And I've never interviewed anybody in, Nevada or New Mexico. So, there are a lot of states that I would love to hear from. And I think that those voices would really enrich our listening experience. And I obviously would love to interview school librarians outside of the countries around the world. I have quite a few friends in New Zealand, thanks to you, and Australia. It's wonderful. But I'd love to interview school librarians in other parts of the world as well. So
get on the phone to Amy, email her.
Exactly. Reach out.
Well,
and friends, there's an FAQ that I include in all of my episodes. So if you have any questions about what you would need to know going into one of these conversations, the fact though is that there are many people who have, like Penny, who have come back again and again and enjoyed being on the show because it is an opportunity to really converse and share this experience of being school librarians wherever you are in the world.
It's fun. It's terrifying to start with, but it's fun. Amy makes it really easy, so do get in touch with her. So Amy, I've got one last little question, and then I've got a few little fun, just quick fire questions just to finish off with. But my last question is, if you're pondering a career in school librarianship, what would be your top piece of advice?
Oh, I have so many mixed feelings about this.
Sorry.
I think you owe it to yourself to learn from school librarians who have been at this for a long time. I think that if you are interested in going into school librarianship, I think you already recognize the need to do your homework, to do that research. In talking to and exchanging emails with students who are considering going into school librarianship, it really has for them been beneficial to hear from other school librarians, those of us who are in the trenches. When I was going into school librarianship, the instructors who were most impactful on me were those who were school librarians by day and instructors by night or on the weekends. And so I think that anybody who's considering making a run at being a school librarian, wherever you happen to be, is having those opportunities to sit down and talk to people who are school librarians. We've tried to replicate those kinds of conversations here on the show. But to get a sense of what it really is like. And I think when you listen to the podcast, we aren't going to sugarcoat what we do. I think you're going to get a very authentic sense of what our days are like, the good days and the bad days.
Absolutely. So in short, you need to listen to School Librarians United. That's basically the answer, isn't it?
Shameless self-promotion.
Shameless. I love it. No, it's great. Now, I do like a quick-fire question. So I've just got a few quick-fire questions, like basically one-word answers to finish off with. So here you go. What is your favourite podcast?
Right now, I'm listening to Noble Blood by Dana Schwartz, who is a YA author. And I love it because it is history and it's great storytelling, but at its core, it is history. And so I was always and will be a history teacher. So for me, it's Noble Blood with Dana Schwartz.
Cool. And what's your favorite movie?
Oh, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou with George Clooney. It is the soundtrack. It is the Odyssey. It's a retelling of Homer's The Odyssey, and it's amazing. It'll stop me in my tracks whenever I am. If it's on the TV, I sit down. I'm not going anywhere. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Never heard of it.
Oh yes, it's very good.
Okay, what is the favorite place that you've ever visited?
Probably the most memorable for me is Iceland. We went there for my daughter's graduation trip. This would have obviously been pre-pandemic, but we went to Iceland, and there is literally no place like it on earth. It boasts near 100% adult literacy and has the highest population of published authors. It's such a high regard for reading and books, and I hope to be able to go back again. But Iceland.
And it is the home of Bjork, who is amazing. My parents have been to Iceland, and I'm quite jealous. I'd like to go there too. Okay, and what would be the place that you would most like to visit that you haven't been to yet?
So I have made mention of the fact that we lived overseas when I was growing up. We moved back to the States the summer I turned 12. And I actually was born in New York. We lived in Japan, the Philippines, Guam, and Saudi Arabia. And then we would take the long way home. So my family and I would spend weeks on holiday coming back. And it was wonderful. It was extraordinary. But I think right now we had sort of set our sights on perhaps Portugal. I've never been to Portugal, and that was I'm something of a foodie. When I'm not climbing the waterfalls of Iceland, I will eat my way through any location I happen to be.
Absolutely, I'm absolutely with you on that. Love a bit of food. If you're an animal, what would you be?
I did a lot of scuba diving when I lived on Guam. So I lived on Guam, but then I returned to Guam, my first teaching job, and I was diving every weekend. And so it would definitely have to be something marine. I would love to be and live in the ocean. And always, that was, I don't know. I think I wanted to be Aquaman when I was growing up. As superheroes, I was living in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, which is hot always. And so I was in the water most often. And I lived in the water, and I wanted to stay there. And that was my superpower. I wanted to breathe under the water. And I'm sure I wanted to be some kind of shark.
Cool. And the very last one, bringing it back round to sort of books and stuff. Is there a book that you wish that you had written?
Oh, I hate writing.
Of course. That was a really stupid question.
No, but you know what? I'll be honest. My dream is someday I want to read an audiobook. I think it's not that I want to write a book. I've never felt my strengths were in writing. Writing for me is like pulling teeth. But I've always, ever since I recognized being a podcaster, I wanted to sort of make that next leap and either do voice acting or read an audiobook that was going to be
That would be so cool. You'd be very good at that. Okay, so, oh God, massive thank you, Amy, for putting up with that. And the tables have definitely been turned and you've had your chance to talk, but normal broadcasting presumably will resume next time around. So
absolutely, absolutely.
You. Kia kaha.
Thank you so much. I knew I wanted you to do this episode because it was your idea and you were the one who clearly had sort of a vision and that's really all it takes. And then we got to press record. Thank you so much.
Yay. Okay. Nice. Yay. Oh my goodness.
Friends, it's times like this that I realize that I have the podcast to thank for the friendships I have been able to make with Penny Walch and other school librarians in New Zealand, especially Julie Huggins and Glenys Bichan. You know, it is a neat opportunity when you can sort of reach out to people that you encounter, in this case, library Twitter, and say, hey, would you like to do an episode? Oh, you're in New Zealand? Well, we can make that work. and you know what? We did and we do. And it's wonderful because I truly recognize the importance of using this space to build that listening community, but also that place where we can share and learn from one another. And I know that there are quite a few school librarians here in the United States who have listened to those episodes that were recorded outside of the United States and realized, you know, we are not alone in many of the struggles that we face. And it gives us such a global perspective when we can invite those conversations in. So I'm very grateful to Penny. Friends, if you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. Be sure to follow on your favorite podcatcher so you'll never miss an episode. And if you really like listening today, consider leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help others find us. One last friendly reminder, friends, I encourage you to take advantage of Capstone's generous $20 discount off an order of $100 or more using the code UNITED. The topic of our next episode will be First Chapter Fridays and my conversation with Kim Palmer. I hope you will tune in.